Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you are well, and I hope, especially if you're in our area, in the Philadelphia environment or in other environs, and it's so gorgeous out, you get to go out and enjoy the beautiful day. This week, we finish up Sefer Shemot with Parshat Pekudei. I've entitled this, Look in the Mirror, and What Do You See? So for this week's discussion, I am going to be using Nechama Leibowitz's framing. She chooses a focus that is quite interesting in the midst of all the jewels and the expensive valued materials and details that are continued in learning that indeed God's instructions were followed in the crafting of the elements of worship, including the dress of those who supervised such and the place in which this occurred, along with all of its components. In using Nechama's teaching, we begin by reaching back to the previous week's Parsha for chapter 38, verse 8, which is part of the recounting of the work of the skilled artisan Bezalel. We read, V'ya'as et ha'kiyor nechoshet et kanu nechoshet b'mar'ot ha'tzva'ot asher tzav'u betach ohem moed. And he made the washstand of copper, and its base was made of copper, from the mirrors of the women who had set up in the area all of their accoutrements and everything they needed, who congregated at the entrance of the tent to the meetings. Remember last week we discussed that the women were involved to the same degree as the men, everybody participated, and now we're going to talk about the women's mirrors that they were using. Before proceeding, remember that we have all seen these details of our Parsha before. I find it interesting to note that 4 of the 7 aliyot finish with the following verses, confirming that first the instructions were given, then they were repeated in terms of the actual enactment, and now we are repeating them yet again upon the completion that everything was done according to the initially provided instructions by God. We read, ותחל כל עבודת משכן אוהל מועד ויעשו בני ישראל ככל אשר ציווה השם את משה כן עשו. All the work of the Mishkan of the tent of meeting has been completed. The children of Israel had done everything according to the way that God had commanded Moshe. That was the way they completed. They did everything just as God had told Moshe, Moshe had told them, and we understand that this threefold chain of command is repeated in the very framework of hearing all the instructions 3 times. B'chol asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe ken asu b'nei Yisrael ta'avada. In accordance with all that God had commanded, so the children of Israel do all the work. And again, this is repeated. Moshe sees the entire work. They have done it as God has commanded. So they had done, so Moshe blesses them. So even in these few pasukim, again, this threefold repetition. Moshe blesses them, and Rashi explains, may it be God's will that the Shekhinah will rest in this work of your hand, for you have done everything according to God's instructions. And this was Moshe's prayer. So Moshe does all of this, that we now go to chapter 40, verse 6. According to God had commanded, he did. And he makes the incense go up as God had commanded Moshe. Chapter 40. Our commentators have much to say about these instructions and the precision to which they were followed, as well as the repetition that may seem superfluous to us, but they're there. How many times have you gone and you've done something and you read a whole bunch of instructions and then you go back, wait a minute, what did it say about that again? So imagine if we're doing this in our daily lives with whatever we are doing. I'll use the example of sewing garments. I sew and you get this whole big thing of instructions, and after you complete every step, you need to go back. I think you do anyway, and make sure that you did that one right before you move on to the next thing. Otherwise, you will end up with the wrong elements in your garment, and it won't work. So, aracha kama v'chama, even more so, talking about the Mishkan, this is clearly the way to go. The materials and the items crafted all contain meaning and purpose. It is at this point that we're going to bring what Nechama frames for us into the discussion. She begins with the commentary of Abravanel, who teaches us that while not mentioned here, the basin and the stand were not made of the bronze indicated for other vessels amongst all of the valuable materials cited, but rather out of the mar'ot hanashim, the mirrors of the women who were at the door of the tent of meeting after their involvement. This is where Abravanel refers us to the passage in chapter 38. As we said, and he made the washstand of copper and its base of copper from the mirrors of the women who were congregating at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Nechama teaches that this text poses challenges, both as regards content and language. What does the phrase mar'ot hatzva'ot asher tzavu mean? We must remember that every detail and every item has to conform to the specific instructions that God gives. Ramban adheres to the plain sense of the text, and thus ends with a question for us to consider. We may perhaps take it in the plain sense that Bezalel made the basin and the stand out of the mirrors of the women who crowded in great numbers. Tzava, army, means legions, right? Who crowded in great numbers and assembled at the door of the tent of meeting to give their mirrors as a free will offering. Thinking about coming as individuals and also coming as sivot, as legions, as a group. So their meaning is not just as each individual comes, but already we've spoken a lot about the concept of kihila, of community, and the collective is more than the sum of its individual parts, and thus we see it here. So the women are acknowledged here, folks. Don't lose that. The women are being focused upon here in terms of giving of their free will offerings. This is interesting because often, especially in the Orthodox world, there's a lot of talk about are women included, and that has actually led to a lot of the antipathy at best and the anger or frustration more profoundly in the non-Orthodox world about why aren't women included. Well, they are included. It's just that a lot of times we may not focus on that as much. And the mirrors that the women give are going to play a very important part. So stay with me for a bit. The bronze of the mirrors was designated for this vessel because it was to have a smooth, polished, hollowed-out surface. When the women saw this, they gathered in their hosts. They gathered in their numbers. They gathered as a collective to donate the mirrors for the making of the basin and the stand. Ramban, so in thinking about this, renders the text as such. The women who crowded at the tent of the meeting, who gathered and stood around, they hand over their gifts as a group. What prompted Moshe in the first place to use the mirrors of the women for the making of the vessel, the women's mirrors, for the making of the vessel, in which the priests would purify themselves on entering the tent of meeting? It was in this very clear, mirrored, hollowed out, polished basin in which they would wash their hands and their feet before entering the tent of the meeting, which they had to do in terms of sanctification, in terms of tahara, in terms of purity. This enabled them to sanctify and complete their deeds. I would suggest that there must be an answer of significance, for are we not taught that every detail here is with reason and symbolic of something meaningful? Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is known for having devoted a great deal of attention to explaining the symbolic significance of the various appurtenances, the various elements of the tabernacle and their respective functions in the divine service. He likewise draws attention to this unusual feature. He says, it is deeply significant that the vessel designated for consecration, kedushat haguf, right, the sanctification of hands and feet, dedicated to elevating and refining the animal movements and instincts of the human being, here the man, the Kohanim, should be made from such a crucial boudoir item as a woman's mirror, an object which is deeply personal, reflects herself to herself, and draws attention to the human body as an object of sensual desire. Ibn Ezra's solution to the problem is diametrically opposed to this. He says, it is customary for every woman to make up her face every morning and look in a bronze or glass mirror in order to adjust her hairstyle and ornaments, as mentioned in Yeshayahu chapter 3. At this point, Yeshayahu is sanctioning, and here's our Haftarah, and criticizing the people for not taking care of others and seeing what the real problems are. Don't look in the mirror, everybody. Look outside. See what's wrong. Don't primp. Instead, focusing on their own importance and vanity. So you see, you have two very diametrically opposed ideas here. One is it's the item of vanity, and one, it's the item of self-reflection. Do I like what I see in the mirror? Going perhaps past physical features to what is reflected in looking at myself, seeing myself, perhaps as others may. So we're going to read now from the Haftarah, chapter 3, verses 18 to 24 of Yeshayahu. Bayamahu, Yatsir Adoshem et Tiferet ha'achasim, v'hashbisim, v'hasacharonim. On that day, God will remove the glory of the shoes or of the footwear, and the embroidered hairdresses and hairnets, the necklaces, the bracelets, the veils, the tiaras, the foot chains, the hair ribbons. In other words, all of the jewelry and all of the cosmetic clothing additions that are associated with women. God will remove all of them. And what else? Verse 23. Hagil yonim. Not mar'eh, not what we see. That's marot is the word for mirrors in our original text, in the Torah text. But here, hagilyonim is used. Gilion, what we reveal, what we see on our inner self, we will remove all of it. And in place of all of that, there will be decay. In place of the girdles that hold in the body and make it look lovely, there will be lacerations, there will be physical problems, and a wound that causes baldness and all negative things instead of beauty. According to Ibn Ezra, who gives us this interpretation and confirming citation of text, many of the Israelite women at that time behaved exactly as the Ishmaelite women in his time, in Ibn Ezra. That's where he was coming from. But there were pious women in Israel who overcame this worldly temptation and freely gave away their mirrors because they found no more need to beautify themselves, but came instead daily to the door of the tent, those legions, to pray and hear religious discourses for their edification. The text says, they crowded at the door of the tent of meeting precisely because there were so many of them. Ibn Ezra discovered the appropriateness of the mirrors for this sacred use in the fact that the women who brought them as an offering to the tabernacle symbolized, therefore, their rejection of vanity. The greatness of these women lay, in Ibn Ezra's words, in the fact that they overcame worldly temptations and found no more need to beautify themselves further. Rachel Adelman adds a historical perspective to this discussion when she suggests that these hosts, these crowds of women, actually were actively involved, the very ones that were actively involved in building the Mishkan, and we should consider them and their roles seriously, beyond giving their mirrors from themselves, she teaches. The only verse in our Torah that attests to women serving in the tabernacle is Shemot, chapter 38, verse 8. The paucity of information about their identity and the nature of their service hints at another narrative lying below the surface that may mysteriously have been suppressed. Two main approaches to filling in this gap exist. The first, a historical critical approach, entailing a reconstruction of what these women might have been doing based on intertextual resonances and evidence from parallel ancient Near Eastern texts and artifacts. The second draws on classical rabbinic midrash, which retells the story of the women's donation of mirrors to the making of the tabernacle. In a creative play with language in the midrash, it is not the women who ministered or served, hatzvaot, but the mirrors themselves, hatzvaot, that raised up the hosts of Israel. In other words, they brought the mirrors, everybody looked, they saw themselves as part of it, and then became part of the event. These generative mirrors that have everybody looking at themselves are melted down to make the basin where the priests will wash before entering the holy sanctuary. These two windows into the biblical text provide different feminist reading strategies for reclaiming the untold stories of women in the ancient world. Whereas Yeshayahu is pointing to the excesses that will be removed, the Torah is pointing to the fact that there was no need for further use of the excesses, and that the women were giving them up, and not only them, but the mirrors that would show how they appeared to others. It should briefly be mentioned, as does Edelman, that there is a second instance, that of Samuel, Shmuel, chapter 2, verse 22, when we read about Eli's sons and their various liaisons with women who were guarding the religious sites. This is problematic, as women were known to serve a very provocative and dangerous role, the temple prostitutes, not validated anyway in Jewish worship and community. These involvements, amplifying Ibn Ezra's point, give us our challenge. But we are focusing on the piety of the women in bringing their mirrors that reflect what the user sees, to the efforts of the community and the collective intention of ensuring God's presence among them, which is the opposite of what we read in Shmuel. Let us consider that the melting down of the mirrors can even be symbolic of disposing of old uses and repurposing materials for more elevated ones, something to think about in our own lives, to be sure. I would like to suggest at this point that we go a little bit further in developing this idea. The women, in behaving righteously and with piety, gave up this most profound symbol of their own vanity to be used by the Kohanim as they were carrying out their functions. By using mirror material, they were forced, the Kohanim, to look at themselves, their bodies, and consider what they were doing and the purpose of their very being. They, too, suffered from a potential misuse, that of the power conferred upon them. As they used these mirrors, they were to be reminded of their own limitations. They were but b'nei Adam, made of basar v'dam, flesh and blood. Mirrors were perhaps to remind them of these limitations and their need for humility, not to primp and to feel like they're better than others. Once again, our assigned Haftarah followed different customs, but are found in this particular one that I'm going to use, chapters 7 and 8 of Melachim 1, where we read about the completion of the Beit HaMikdash, following the parallel example of our Parsha, and even referring directly to it. Chapter 7. And all the work that King Shlomo had wrought, V'tishlam kol malacha asher asa Melech Shlomo, Bet Hashem, in the house of God, was finished. Shlomo brought in the things which David his father had dedicated, the kesef, ha-zahav, ha-kelim, the silver, the gold, the vessels, and put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. I have surely built you a house to dwell in a settled place for you to dwell forever. And he said, Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael Asher Diber B'Piv Et David Avi U'Biyado Milei Limor. Just as we saw in the Torah portion, it goes from God to Moshe, to the people. Here it goes from God to David to Shlomo. And then the reference back in history. Since the day that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, Min hayam asher hatzeti et ami at Yisrael mitzrayim lo bacharti be'ir b'kol shivtei Yisrael. I chose no city out of the tribes of Israel to build a house. But I did choose that my name will be here, and I chose David to be over my people Israel. And it was in the heart of David, my father, says Shlomo, to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. God says to David, because remember, David will not get to build the temple. It will be Shlomo who finishes the work. Since it was in your heart to build a house into my name, you did well that it was in your heart. As we know, David will not be the one to build the Beit Mikdash. The desire of his heart, just as Moshe will not go into the land of Eretz, Canaan, or Yisrael. There's a wonderful statement: if something is truly worthwhile, it will take more than one generation to do it. I think when we think about legacy, sometimes it's unfinished tasks that we bequeath to the next generation. And just as Moshe is facilitating the people building the Mishkan, and who will and will not go into Eretz Yisrael, and David will not be the one to build the temple, we all still stand as part of this collective. We are all but people, limited humans, who are here hopefully to fulfill a purpose and make the world better. We are not perfect, as we learned in the text from Isaiah, and where people are warned that they are not doing things correctly, and that all these beautification items will be taken away from them. That was in Isaiah, Yeshayahu chapter 3, I believe it was, that Ibn Ezra referred to. And in our Haftarah that we will read, we are told that the instructions were followed. Okay? Moshe led the people to the point where they would find fulfillment. David did the same. Let us think about this. What is our purpose? What are each of us sent here to do? Will we acknowledge the limits of our capacity when we look in our own mirrors? Or will looking in the mirror result in an inflated sense of self? The women melt down their mirrors. It becomes part of the basins. It's supposed to be part of the generational legacy of the Jews through the Mishkan. The mirrors that the women gave for the building of the vessels that were used for the cleansing of the body can and should also be a means of reflection for all of us. What do we each see when we look in our mirrors? And with that, we close Sefer Shemot, Chazak Chazak Ve'Nitchazek. And I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. Lehitraat.